What if the real villain in modern fantasy isn't on the screen, but behind the camera? After more than 2 decades of analyzing fantasy storytelling across literature and screen adaptations, I've uncovered a disturbing trend that's slowly corrupting the essence of our beloved genre. Hollywood, and for the sake of this video I mean not just traditional studios, but streaming giants like Netflix and Amazon too, is rewriting the rules of fantasy, and not in a good way. In this video, I'll reveal how the entertainment industry's approach is damaging fantasy storytelling in 3 critical ways. A dangerous obsession that's overshadowing the heart of fantasy, a misguided strategy that's stripping away the magic, and a fundamental flaw in the storytelling process that's killing immersion. By the end of this video, you'll be able to spot these storytelling assassins from a mile away, and you'll understand why your favorite fantasy franchises might be in more danger than you ever realized. At its core, great fantasy transports us to worlds of wonder and magic, while exploring universal human themes. It's not just about dragons and wizards, it's about crafting rich, immersive universes that feel alive and lived in. The best fantasy stories feature complex, relatable characters whose struggles, despite the fantastical setting, resonate with our own experiences. Think of the meticulous world building of Tolkien's Middle-earth, the profound themes in Ursula K. Le Guin's Earthsea, or the blend of humor and insight in Terry Pratchett's Discworld. These works captivate us not just with their imaginative elements, but with their deep exploration of human nature, morality, and the human condition. But as fantasy gained popularity, Hollywood saw dollar signs, and thus began the era of big-budget fantasy adaptations that often miss the mark on what makes this genre truly magical. It's like trying to capture the majesty of the Grand Canyon through a keyhole. That's how Hollywood often frames expansive fantasy universes. Let me zoom in on 2 major examples that have been making waves in recent years, and not always in a good way. First, The Witcher from Netflix. Its budget, a whopping $318.7 million. For just the first 2 seasons alone. Its reception was mixed, with praise for Henry Cavill's performance, but criticism for confusing timelines and deviation from the source material. Netflix threw a pile of gold coins at The Witcher, hoping to create the next Game of Thrones. But instead of focusing on the rich lore and complex character relationships from Andrzej Sapkowski's books, they seemed more interested in how many monsters Geralt could slay in slow motion. Henry Cavill, a self-professed fan of the books and games, brought Geralt to life with a gruff charisma that won over many viewers, myself included. His dedication to the role was evident, from his physical preparation to his insistence on staying true to the character's essence. However, even Cavill's stellar performance couldn't fully compensate for the show's narrative shortcomings. In a twist that perfectly illustrates Hollywood's mishandling of fantasy properties, Cavill announced his departure from the show after its 3rd season. This decision sent shockwaves through the fanbase and highlighted the growing disconnect between the adaptation and its source material. Now, let's turn our gaze towards The Rings of Power from Amazon. Its budget, an eye-watering $465 million for the 1st season alone, with season 2 supposedly even reaching an absurd amount of $700 million. Amazon's approach to The Rings of Power was like trying to recreate the Sistine Chapel with a box of crayons and unlimited funds. They had the money, they had the source material, but somewhere along the way, they lost the magic that made Middle-earth feel real. The show's massive budget is evident in its breathtaking visuals and grand set pieces, yes. However, many fans and critics have pointed out that the series often prioritizes spectacle over substance. The pacing has been a particular point of contention, with some arguing that the show moves too slowly in some areas while rushing through important character and plot development in others. Moreover, the decision to compress thousands of years of Middle-earth history into a much shorter time frame has led to a significant deviation from Tolkien's established lore. Now, while adaptations often require changes, the extent of these alterations has left many longtime fans feeling disconnected from the world they thought they knew, let alone the fact that the cast fails to reproduce really engaging characters that viewers crave to follow. Such adaptations, like the 2 we just discussed, while visually impressive, often miss the mark when it comes to capturing the essence of what makes fantasy truly great. And that brings us to the heart of the problem. Imagine going to a 5-star restaurant only to be served a beautifully plated dish that tastes like cardboard. That's what's happening with many modern fantasy adaptations. Hollywood has fallen into this spectacle trap, prioritizing visual effects and action sequences over the substance that gives fantasy its heart and soul. It's like they've mistaken the icing for the cake. Take the 2010 remake of Clash of the Titans as a bit older example. It was a visual feast with stunning CGI monsters and epic battle scenes. But beneath all this glitz and glamour, a hollow shell of a story that failed to capture the mythic quality of the original. This obsession with spectacle comes at a cost. Character development suffers, because when all the budget goes into CGI, there's little left for crafting nuanced, relatable characters. We end up with flat protagonists who are about as deep as a puddle in the Sahara. Then world building takes a backseat. Instead of immersing us in rich lived-in worlds, we get shiny surface level settings that feel about as authentic as a plastic plant. And themes get lost in the translation as well. The profound themes that make fantasy resonate with our real-world experiences often get buried on an avalanche of special effects. But here's the thing, true fantasy fans aren't fooled by pretty packaging. We crave substance, depth, and stories that make us think and feel. A dragon might look impressive on screen, but if we don't care about the characters it's threatening, what's the point? And yet, Hollywood's mishandling of fantasy doesn't stop at prioritizing spectacle. There's another troubling trend that's stripping away the very essence of what makes these stories timeless. Hollywood's attempts to modernize fantasy often feel like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. It's not that fantasy cannot address contemporary issues. It absolutely can, and probably should. The problem arises when these modern elements are shoehorned in without proper integration. Let's take a deeper look at the 2017 film Bright as a prime example of this modernization gone wrong. On paper, the concept seemed promising. An urban fantasy that blends magical creatures with a gritty modern-day Los Angeles, all while attempting to tackle issues of racism and social inequality. However, the execution fell flat on multiple levels. The film's allegory for racial tensions, with orcs standing in for marginalized groups, was about as subtle as a troll with a sledgehammer. Instead of thoughtfully exploring these themes, Bright relied on heavy-handed metaphors and surface-level commentary that failed to do justice to the complex issues it aimed to address. Moreover, the film struggled to seamlessly integrate its fantastical elements with its modern setting. The result was a world that felt neither convincingly magical nor authentically contemporary. Elves running high-end fashion boutiques and orcs joining police forces could have been fascinating world-building details, but they came across as gimmicky rather than well-thought-out aspects of a cohesive universe. The dialogue too often fell jarringly out of place. Characters swung between pseudo-mystical pronouncements and modern-day expletives, creating a tonal whiplash that made it difficult for viewers to immerse themselves in the story's world. This misguided modernization is problematic for several reasons. First, it breaks immersion. When anachronistic elements or poorly integrated modern concepts crop up in a fantasy setting, it shatters the illusion of the world we're supposed to be lost in. It also undermines the themes. Many classic fantasy stories deal with timeless human struggles. By forcing modern sensibilities onto these tales without nuance, we often lose the universal appeal that made them resonate in the first place. And then it creates tonal inconsistency. One moment we're dealing with ancient prophecies and magic wands, the next we're navigating LA traffic and police bureaucracy. This inconsistency makes it hard for viewers to connect emotionally with the story or take its fantastical elements seriously. Now don't get me wrong, fantasy should evolve and reflect our changing world, but there is a difference between thoughtful evolution and slapping a fresh coat of paint on a classic and calling it updated. The best fantasy adaptations find ways to make their themes relevant to modern audiences without sacrificing the integrity of their world. It's a delicate balance, yes, but when done right, it creates stories that are both timeless and timely. Bright could have been a groundbreaking blend of fantasy and social commentary. Instead, it serves as a cautionary tale of how to not modernize the genre. But modernization isn't the last pitfall awaiting fantasy adaptations either. There's another equally insidious threat that's robbing these stories of their magic. Imagine trying to read The Lord of the Rings in 15 minutes. Sounds absurd, right? Yet this is essentially what many modern fantasy adaptations are attempting to do. In the race to keep audiences hooked, Hollywood often sacrifices the slow burn of good storytelling for the quick fix of constant action. It's like they're afraid we'll change the channel if there isn't an explosion or a plot twist every 5 minutes. The 2017 adaptation of Stephen King's The Dark Tower serves as a prime example of this rushed storytelling approach. King's original series spans 8 novels, weaving a complex tapestry of fantasy, western, and horror elements. The film attempted to condense this sprawling narrative into a mere 95 minutes. The result was a disjointed, rushed experience that failed to capture the depth and complexity of King's world. Characters that readers had spent thousands of pages getting to know were reduced to shallow caricatures. Roland Deschamps, the last gunslinger, became a generic action hero rather than the complex, tormented figure from the books. The Man in Black, one of King's most chilling villains, was reduced to a forgettable antagonist with unclear motivations. Moreover, the rich mythology of the books, the concept of the Dark Tower itself, the significance of the beams, the history of Midworld, was stripped down to its bare bones. This left newcomers confused and fans deeply disappointed. The film's attempt to cram in elements from various books in the series resulted in a narrative that felt both overstuffed and underdeveloped. This lack of patience in storytelling has several negative consequences. There's the lack of atmosphere. Fantasy worlds need time to breathe. When we rush from plot point to plot point, we lose the opportunity to immerse ourselves in this setting. Then there are underdeveloped characters. Character growth takes time. When we don't give characters room to evolve naturally, their arcs feel forced and unearned. And there's also the loss of nuance. Complex themes and intricate plot lines need space to unfold as well. Rushing through these elements often results in oversimplification. And then there is the emotional disconnect. When we're not giving time to connect with characters and their world, it's hard to care about what happens to them. Remember, some of the most powerful moments in fantasy come from the quiet scenes, conversations between characters that reveal their motivations and struggles. These moments of character development and world building cannot be rushed. The irony is that in trying to keep audiences engaged, this rushed approach often achieves the opposite. Instead of being drawn in, viewers are left feeling disconnected and unsatisfied. Now, if you found anything useful in the video so far, please consider giving it a like to help me grow the channel. Thank you. Moving on, what happens then when Hollywood continues down this path of prioritizing spectacle over substance, forcing modernization and rushing through stories? Well, the consequences are far-reaching and potentially devastating for the fantasy genre. First, we have disappointed fans, obviously. Loyal readers of fantasy literature are left feeling betrayed when their beloved stories are twisted beyond recognition. It's like ordering a dragon and getting a lizard with cardboard wings. Then we have the misrepresentation of the genre. For many, these adaptations are their first exposure to fantasy. If this is all they see, they might conclude that fantasy is all style and no substance, missing out on the rich, thought-provoking nature of the entire genre. And just think about the financial flops. When adaptations fail to capture the magic of their source material, they often underperform at the box office. This can lead studios to become wary of investing in fantasy projects, potentially stifling the genre's growth in visual media. And then of course there's the damage to the source material. Poor adaptations can tarnish the reputation of even the most beloved books. It's like having a bad cover version become more famous than the original song. And just think about discouraging new writers. Aspiring fantasy authors might feel pressured to write with adaptation in mind, potentially compromising their creative vision to fit Hollywood's formula. The cumulative effect of these consequences could be a watering down of the entire fantasy genre. Instead of rich, diverse stories that challenge our imagination and explore complex themes, we risk ending up with a simplified product that's more concerned with marketability than storytelling. However, with all that said, before we resign ourselves to a future of lackluster fantasy adaptations, let's take a moment to consider the bright spots in the genre's on-screen history. Because in the midst of disappointing adaptations and missed opportunities, there have been shining examples that prove it's possible to bring complex fantasy worlds to the screen without losing their essence. First, there is of course the Lord of the Rings trilogy, the gold standard. Peter Jackson's adaptation of Tolkien's epic remains the pinnacle of fantasy films. Its success came from a deep respect for the source material, meticulous attention to world-building details, allowing the story to unfold at its own pace across 3 films, and balancing spectacular visuals with heartfelt character moments. The trilogy showed that it's possible to create a faithful adaptation that satisfies both die-hard fans and newcomers to the genre. It proved that respecting the source material and focusing on strong storytelling fundamentals can lead to both critical acclaim and commercial success. Luckily, the success of fantasy adaptations isn't limited to just the past. Recent years have seen some promising developments that show Hollywood can still get it right when they put their minds to it. Take the early seasons of Game of Thrones, for example. Before it stumbled in later seasons, Game of Thrones was a masterclass in fantasy adaptation. It succeeded because it also respected the source material while making necessary adaptations for TV. It took its time to develop characters and plot lines. It balanced its fantastical elements with grounded, relatable human drama. The early seasons of Game of Thrones demonstrated that complex, adult-oriented fantasy can find a massive audience when done right. It showed that viewers are willing to invest in intricate storylines and morally ambiguous characters if the storytelling is compelling enough. And the fact that the show only really started to derail when the source material of the books ended tells a lot. Now, a last example then is Dune with its 2 newest movies. While not strictly fantasy, the recent adaptation of Frank Herbert's sci-fi classic shows how to do justice to complex source material. When looked at closer, we see that it wasn't afraid to take its time, covering only half of the first book in one film. It also balanced spectacular visuals with thoughtful character development. And it trusted the audience's intelligence, not over-explaining every concept. Dune proves that even in today's fast-paced media landscape, there's still room for patient, thoughtful adaptations of complex works. It shows that audiences are willing to engage with challenging material if it's presented with care and respect. These successes, both past and present, offer valuable lessons for future fantasy adaptations. They prove that when filmmakers prioritize storytelling, respect the source material, and trust their audience, magic can happen on screen as well. The future of fantasy on screen isn't written in stone yet, because with every new project, there's an opportunity to learn from past mistakes and build on past successes. And as fans, we have a role to play too here. By supporting adaptations that stay true to the spirit of fantasy and voicing our concerns about those that don't, we can help shape the future of the genre. So the next time you see a fantasy adaptation announced, look beyond the budget or star power. Seek out signs that the creators truly understand what makes fantasy magical. With the right approach, Hollywood can do more than just adapt fantasy stories, and can bring whole new worlds to life, capturing the wonder and depth that drew us to the genre in the first place. And when it comes to writing your own stories, check out this video here, where I share insights from 25 years of fantasy writing so that you can learn from my experience and avoid my mistakes along the way.